Hi, my name is Jennifer Ehring, and I'm one of the nutritionists at Tennessee Farmers Co-op. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about feeding the horse and some special considerations we need to think about with our equine customers. So the digestive tract of a horse is a bit different than that of a cow. A horse is considered a non-ruminant herbivore, so they do not have a rumen like cattle do. And they're actually hindgut fermenters. So all that fermentation of the fibrous material that they consume gets digested and broke down in the hindgut rather than that in the foregut like happens with cattle and sheep and goats. If we look at the diagram here, you can kind of get a feel for what the GI tract of the horse looks like. The stomach makes up a quite small part of the entire tract, with the cecum and the large colon in the hindgut actually making up a large proportion of the tract. That also relates to the importance of those organs in their role in digestion in the horse. So there's a lot going on in the hindgut. If we start looking at the mouth of a horse is a little bit different than some of the other species in that it has very, very prehensile lips. It's able to selectively pick up grass and grains with their lips. And in general, horses have 40 to 42 teeth. The males do, and females have 36 to 48 teeth. They are continually erupting once they have their adult teeth in. So they're not growing new teeth, they're just wearing them down. So over time, they'll actually wear their teeth down to the point where they really don't have much left for teeth. And so for those older horses, we have to make some special considerations and do some different things to help them get the nutrition that they need, because they don't have the teeth that they need to break down those feeds. Once feed is brought into the mouth, whether that's a grain or whether that's a grass, tongue moves it back towards the molars, and the molars actually do the grinding, and they break down those feedstuffs into smaller particle sizes that increase the surface area for the action of the digestive enzymes that feedstuff will encounter a little bit further down the tract. Feed is swallowed and moves down the esophagus. As it's swallowed, there's quite a bit of saliva that goes with it. And that saliva plays a pretty important role in wetting the food and lubricating it so it moves down the esophagus well. In general, horses actually produce about 10 gallons of saliva a day, so that's quite a lot. And the reason that is because saliva plays such an important role in buffering the acidity of the stomach. And so compared to other species, the horse actually is a continuous gastric acid secretor. So there's always gastric acid being secreted in the stomach. And so that saliva, that kind of continual flow of saliva or frequent flow of saliva to the stomach, plays a really important role in keeping that a healthy pH. The stomach in the horse is quite small relative to the rest of the GI tract. It makes up about 8% of the whole tract, and feed doesn't really stay in there too long, about 2 to 6 hours. And so once it's done in the stomach, there's a little bit of digestion that goes on there. A lot of the protein digestion is initiated, and then that digestion is continued as that food moves down into the small intestine. And so that's where most of the digestion and absorption actually occurs, is in that small intestine. So the sugars, the starch, the protein, and the fats are all digested and absorbed there. Vitamins and minerals are also absorbed in the small intestine. You may say, what is left after all that is digested? And what is left is actually the fibrous component of the forage or the feed that they're consuming. Whatever is not digested and absorbed in the small intestine moves on to the large intestine. And the large intestine is made up of the cecum, the large colon, and the small colon. And it's about 25 foot in length, so it's quite a distance. And it is wrapped up several times within the abdominal cavity of the horse. And the large intestine houses millions of bacteria that actually do the work of breaking down the fiber. And so keeping those microbial populations happy, keeping them in an environment that they like, is really important so that they can do their job well. So when the microbial populations break down the fiber through that fermentation process, the result is the production of VFAs, or volatile fatty acids. And in the horse, along with the ruminants, those volatile fatty acids that are produced as a result of that fermentation are absorbed into the bloodstream, and they're actually used as an energy source. So for the horse, the fiber, forage, and from pasture and hay does play a very important role. Those microbial populations also produce some B vitamins, and so that's where some of the B vitamins are actually, we supplement the horse's diet with some B vitamins, but we also know that they're receiving some from those microbial populations in their hindgut. So if we talk about the nutrients that are important to the horse, we see a lot of the same nutrients show up that we see in other species. Of the nutrients that are important, they can be broken down into these 6 different categories. If we take a look at each one individually, you see that water is the most important nutrient of those that were listed on that previous slide. Horses can live a couple weeks without actually consuming any food, but they can only live for about 3 or 4 days without consuming water. So while neither of those practices are preferred, it goes to show you how much more important water is to the overall health of an animal. Water plays an important role in the digestion process and in the absorption process, and it also helps with temperature regulation within the body. And a lot of times we think about horses getting their water from what we offer them in a water tank or trough, but they also obtain some of that water from feed. So if we think about the moisture content of hay versus that of a pasture, there's quite a bit of difference in that moisture content, and so they are obtaining some moisture from that pasture. Water consumption varies considerably based on what the animal is doing and kind of their physiological stage. A horse that's standing out at pasture not really doing a whole lot would probably consume somewhere between 4 and 10 gallons per day. And obviously, their natural activity would affect that, the ambient conditions would affect that. And then a horse that's working heavily, those horses tend to be sweating a lot. Those horses might drink upwards of 20 gallons a day. So it's really important that we always provide our horses with plenty of clean, fresh water. It's something that we want to give them free choice to in nearly all situations. The next nutrient we had listed was carbohydrates. And for the horse, carbohydrates are really the primary source of energy in the diet that we provide. Carbohydrates can be divided into 2 different types: the non-structural carbohydrates, which we think of mostly as the sugars and the starches, and the grains that we feed our horses are very high in those types of carbohydrates. The other type of carbohydrate would be considered a structural carbohydrate, and that's truly the fiber, and those would be high in the forages, whether those are conserved forages like hay or whether they're fresh forages like pasture. Regardless of whether they're non-structural or structural carbohydrates, the horse really relies most on carbohydrates as their energy source. Fats are also something that we can use as an energy source. A lot of times we use it supplementally. It's not something that we would want to feed only to the horse, but we can use it to top dress on top of a grain-based diet or a straight forage-based diet. Fats contain about 2.25 times as much energy as a carbohydrate would, so it's a much more energy dense. In forages and grains, what we typically feed horses are low in fat, so there's a lot of opportunity to go ahead and add supplemental fat to their diet. And fats tend to be highly digestible, so it's a good way to get additional energy into the horse. Fats also provide what we call a calm energy, and so the energy that's associated with the non-structural carbohydrates, the sugars and the starches, tend to be a much more excitable energy, and we compare it to giving a kid a candy bar, where they kind of come up on this sugar high, whereas fats provide what we'd say a slower release of energy, so it's a much more sustaining energy source. It's a little bit longer term in terms of its availability that can be obtained from supplementing the horse's diet. And we can do that with something like corn oil or a vegetable oil. We can also do it with, there's a variety of products out there, and the co-op has one. It is called Pinnacle Energy Plus, and it is basically a stabilized rice bran fat product, and it's something that can easily be top dressed on top of another feed to provide those extra energy or those extra calories that a horse may need. Protein, if we think about what the protein in a horse's diet typically is, it's somewhere between 7 and 10%, and that really depends on what the horse's function is. young growing horses need a higher protein diet than a horse standing out in pasture. But we need to provide a way to get amino acids into the body, and we do that via protein. So amino acids are the building blocks of protein, and amino acids are what the body uses to build muscle. And so they also play a really important role in a lot of enzyme functions and hormone functions in the body. So they have a pretty important job. In other species, we talk about quality and quantity of amino acids. And in horses, quality is really more important than quantity. And so we talk about a 10% protein versus a 14% protein. And inherently, we think that that higher number of protein means that it's better. And that may or may not be the case. Proteins, as I mentioned, are made up of amino acids, and the profile of those amino acids needs to match what the horse's requirements are. So if we can do a good job of matching the profile of their requirements with the feed, that would be considered a higher quality protein, and it would actually be better for the horse to feed a lower protein feed that had the more appropriate amino acid content rather than feeding a high protein feed. As I mentioned, protein is required in a greater amount in the young growing horses because they are laying down all that muscle. Protein is not necessarily a very efficient energy source. The horse's body utilizes carbohydrates and fats much more efficiently, and so it's a better way to provide energy, whereas protein is not really utilized very well. And so if we are over supplementing protein in a lot of in excess, we in a lot of cases are simply wasting our money. Vitamins. Vitamins are one of those things that are needed in pretty small amounts in the body, but they have a really important role. And in the horse's diet, they get a lot of those vitamins from quality forages, but that's also where the fortified manufactured feeds come in. So that's where we as feed manufacturers and nutritionists really look to make up the balance that might be deficient in forages. Minerals also, like vitamins, are required in very small amounts, but they have a critical role in the digestive process as well as laying down good bone and teeth. The macro minerals are required in a little bit higher levels, and you can see that they include calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, sodium, chloride, sulfur, and potassium. The micro minerals are required in lower amounts, but they are still important. The other thing to think about or consider is the calcium to phosphorus ratio. A lot of the grains that we feed are low in calcium and high in phosphorus, and the ideal calcium to phosphorus ratio is somewhere around 2-to-1. And so as nutritionists, we work to formulate feeds that correct that natural imbalance. So I already mentioned a moment ago that that how important energy is, and that we utilize carbohydrates and fats more so than protein. And the carbohydrates are really what the horse uses most. And a lot of those carbohydrates would be the non-structural carbohydrates from grains, but also those structural carbohydrates from the forages. So how do we go about feeding the horse? Well, obviously the horse is a grazer, so he requires small, frequent meals. We notice the small size of his stomach. Horses, if they're left to their own device, will graze 14 to 18 hours a day and travel quite a bit. They move about the pasture quite a bit. So their ability to digest a large amount of feed at a given time is kind of limited because of the size of their stomach. And so it's one of those things where forage needs to be the foundation of the diet. It is really the most important ingredient, I guess you'd say, for all classes of horses. It is a relatively inexpensive source of nutrients. Forage also plays a really important role in normal GI function and natural behaviors. We talked about the chewing action of that hay stimulating saliva production and buffering the GI tract, stomach specifically, so that plays a really important role. And we also need to keep those microbial populations in the hindgut happy and healthy. And if we're not providing adequate forage in the diet, we can affect their environment, and that can have negative implications. So how much forage does a horse need? At a bare minimum, we need to provide 1 to 1.5 percent of body weight per day. The actual amount depends on the nutrient requirements of the horse, the forage quality, and then whether or not a concentrate is offered. Obviously, if we're not going to offer a concentrate, we need to offer a much higher quality forage. In the Southeast, the forages that are available to us typically do not meet all of the horse's requirements. They will meet many of them, but probably will not meet all of them. And so that's where the idea of a commercial feed comes in, and that is really to fulfill any of those nutritional deficiencies. So when we formulate a feed, we formulate it with a specific class of horse in mind. That might be a young growing animal, that might be a maintenance animal, that might be a performance horse. But they all have different requirements, and so we formulate each one of those specifically. In the co-op line, we have both textured and pelleted feeds, and both of those have their own advantages and disadvantages. The advantages, of course, of a textured feed would be the palatability, and the advantages of the pelleted feed would be the uniformity of the product itself. Horses are notorious for being able to select out certain grains, so they may eat all the oats and leave the corn in a textured feed, whereas in a pelleted feed you don't have that type of a problem. The other thing to consider is the idea of a mixed grain versus a fortified feed. Those are really two different things. Mixed grains are simply just mixing corn and oats together, and as I mentioned before, that inverted calcium to phosphorus ratio can be pretty challenging, and so if we want to feed a well-balanced diet, we need to do something to correct that imbalance. And a lot of folks end up cutting their feed with oats as a way to save a little bit of money. And when we do that, we really do mess with that calcium to phosphorus ratio, and we can affect the balance of all the other macro and micronutrients in that feed. And so in a lot of cases, cutting with oats can be more detrimental than it can be beneficial. There are several feeds available through co-op. The premium horse feed line is Co-op Pinnacle, and there are several products in it that work on young growing animals all the way up to the senior horses. They all have a little bit different nutrient requirements, as I mentioned, and so there's a place for each and every one of those. There are also several feeds that are formulated for those basic maintenance type horses. And so visit with your local feed specialist to learn more about the products that are available and what might be most appropriate for the customers in your area. Just a couple of feeding management tips to consider. Feeding at the same time each day is really important, probably more so in horses and maybe some of the other species. So as your customers come in, it's important to emphasize to them the consistency of their feeding practices. Individually feeding is obviously preferred over group feeding because you can monitor intake, make sure that the right horses are getting the right amount of feed. It's also more management intensive, so it certainly has its challenges. But when possible, it's best to individually feed horses. Horses should be fed at least twice a day if they're going to be fed more than about 5 pounds of a concentrate or a grain mix at a time. And horses certainly need fiber in their diet, and at that bare minimum, we're looking to get that 1 to 1.5% of body weight on a daily basis. Concentrates have an important role in the diet of the horse, but they really are meant to fulfill any deficiencies that the fiber or the forage in the diet has. So they are not necessarily the answer to the entire horse's diet or ration. And any changes in the diet should be made gradually over a period of at least 7 to 10 days. And that's just to allow microbial populations in the horse to adapt to those new diets. Sound nutrition plays a vital role in overall health. So feeding a quality feed in the correct manner is really just as important as good veterinary care. So if you have any questions at all about the products that are available through the co-op, please don't hesitate to contact your feed specialist. Thank you.